The forest doesn't make sounds at 3:17 a.m. Not anymore. Marcus Chen pressed his face against the cold glass of Fire Tower 7, watching the tree line with eyes that hadn't slept properly in weeks. The radio crackled with static, then died. Again. It always died at exactly 3:17 a.m., and it always came back at 3:23 a.m. with 6 minutes of silence that felt like drowning. Something moved between the Douglas firs, too tall to be a deer, too fluid to be human. Marcus's breath fogged the window as he reached for his logbook, hands trembling as he wrote Day 47. Movement detected. Sector 12. Rule violation suspected. The smell hit him then. Sweet copper mixed with rotting pine needles drifting up through the floorboards like an accusation. His stomach lurched. That smell meant only one thing in Olympic National Forest: someone had broken the rules. Someone always broke the rules. Marcus fumbled for his radio, knowing it wouldn't work, knowing he'd get nothing but that terrible static that sounded almost like screaming if you listened too closely. The thing in the trees was getting closer now, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the moonlit ground. It moved wrong joints, bending in directions that made his eyes water. Day 47, he whispered into the dead radio. I'm Marcus Chen, Fire Lookout at Tower 7. If anyone finds this recording... His voice cracked. The rules aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're the only thing keeping us alive out here. The shadow stopped directly below his tower and looked up. Welcome back to my channel, everyone. I'm your host, bringing you another true horror story from the Pacific Northwest. Before we dive into Marcus's terrifying experience, let me ask, where are you watching from tonight? Are you alone? Maybe turn on some lights for this one. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story gives you chills, and subscribe for more real horror experiences. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this one ends. Now let's talk about the rules that keep Forest Service employees alive. 3 months earlier, Marcus Chen had thought the job posting was too good to be true. Fire lookout position in Olympic National Forest, decent pay, solitude, and all the nature photography opportunities he could want. Fresh out of college with a forestry degree and student debt crushing his shoulders, he'd applied immediately. The interview had been strange. District Ranger Patricia Walsh sat across from him in a sterile government office, her weathered hands folded over a manila folder that never opened. She asked the usual questions: experience, physical fitness, comfort with isolation. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the tree line like she expected something to emerge. There are rules, Mr. Chen, she'd said finally. Specific protocols you must follow. No exceptions, no questions. Can you handle that? Marcus had nodded eagerly. Rules were easy. Follow procedure, file reports, watch for fires. Simple. If only he'd known. Tower 7 sat 40 feet above the forest floor, accessible only by a narrow service road that wound through increasingly dense woodland. The structure itself was basic: a small cabin on stilts with windows on all sides, radio equipment, and a logbook that previous lookouts had filled with mundane observations about weather patterns and wildlife sightings. Mundane until Marcus started reading between the lines. Day 12. Heard crying in Sector 9. Followed protocol. Do not investigate. Day 23. Lights moving below tree line at 2 a.m. Stayed inside. Logged incident. Day 31. Radio picked up transmission in unknown language. Switched to emergency channel immediately. The rule book had been waiting on his desk that first morning, a hand-typed document, pages yellowed with age and marked with coffee stains and what looked suspiciously like blood. 23 specific protocols, each more bizarre than the last. Rule 1. Never leave the tower between sunset and sunrise. Rule 7. If you hear your name called from the forest, do not respond. Do not look toward the sound. Rule 12. If the radio picks up children singing, switch to emergency channel immediately and file incident report. Rule 18. Animals that approach the tower base and stare upward for more than 10 minutes are not animals. Log as security concern. Rule 23. If you see lights moving below the tree line in patterns, close all curtains and do not observe until dawn. Marcus had laughed initially. Some elaborate hazing ritual for new employees, probably. The Pacific Northwest had always attracted eccentric types. Maybe this was just part of the local culture. But as days passed and the isolation settled into his bones like morning fog, the rules began to feel less like jokes and more like lifelines. The forest was too quiet. That became obvious within the first week. No bird songs at dawn, no rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. Just the whisper of wind through evergreen branches and an occasional creak from the tower's support beams. Even the usual sounds of civilization, distant traffic, aircraft overhead seemed muffled here, as if the trees themselves absorbed and swallowed noise. But worse than the silence were the exceptions to it. Sounds that had no business existing in these woods. Children's laughter echoing from empty clearings, metal clanging against metal in the pre-dawn darkness, and sometimes, just sometimes, voices calling his name with perfect pronunciation from deeper in the forest than any human had business being. Marcus had started keeping the rule book close, consulting it like a Bible whenever something felt wrong. And something always felt wrong in Olympic National Forest. The first real incident happened on his 19th night. Marcus had settled into an uneasy routine by then: morning weather reports, afternoon wildlife observations, evening equipment checks, and careful adherence to the rules that kept him safely locked inside his tower from sunset to dawn. He'd even started to convince himself that the previous entries in the logbook were just the product of isolation-induced paranoia. That delusion shattered at 11:47 p.m. on a moonless Tuesday. He was updating his log when he heard children's voices drifting up from the forest floor. Not the distant echo he might expect from a camping family, but clear, distinct singing that seemed to emanate from directly below his tower. The melody was unfamiliar, haunting something between a lullaby and a funeral dirge. Marcus's hand froze over the logbook as the words reached him. Come and play, come and stay, where the shadows dance and sway. Leave your tower, leave your light. Join us in eternal night. His blood turned to ice water. Rule 12 flashed through his mind. If the radio picks up children singing, switch to emergency channel immediately and file incident report. But this wasn't coming through the radio. This was live, happening right now beneath his feet. The singing grew louder, more voices joining the chorus. Marcus crept to the east window and peered down, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. What he saw made his rational mind stutter and crash. 7 children stood in a perfect circle around the tower's base. Their clothes were old-fashioned Victorian-era dresses and knickers that gleamed white in the darkness, despite the absence of any light source. They held hands and swayed gently as they sang, their faces turned upward toward his window with expressions of innocent joy. But their eyes were black holes that seemed to drink in what little starlight filtered through the canopy. Marcus stumbled backward, knocking over his coffee mug. The ceramic shattered against the floor with a sound like gunshot, and the singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete, it made his ears ring. When he finally worked up the courage to look again, the children were gone. His hands shook as he reached for the radio, but hesitated. The rules didn't cover this exact scenario. The children hadn't been singing through the radio, they'd been physically present. Did that still count as Rule 12? Or was this something else entirely? The radio crackled to life before he could decide. Tower 7, this is base. Report your status. Ranger Walsh's voice cut through the static, professional but strained. Base, this is Tower 7. Marcus's voice came out as a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. Base, I have a situation to report. Nature of situation. Marcus glanced at the rule book, then back at the empty circle below. Possible Rule 12 violation. Children singing, not through radio, physical presence at tower base. The silence stretched so long, Marcus wondered if the connection had died. Finally, Walsh's voice returned, carefully controlled. Copy that, Tower 7. File incident report immediately. Under no circumstances are you to leave the tower or attempt visual confirmation. Maintain position until dawn. Acknowledge. Acknowledged base. Tower 7. How many children did you observe? The question sent fresh ice through Marcus's veins. How had she known he'd seen them? 7 base. Arranged in a circle formation. Another long pause. When Walsh spoke again, her professional mask had cracked slightly. "Marcus, I need you to listen very carefully. Those children died in 1943. Tuberculosis outbreak at a logging camp that used to sit where your tower stands now. They're not supposed to be able to manifest that clearly." Marcus's legs gave out. He slumped into his chair, staring at the spot where the children had stood. "What do you mean, manifest?" "File your report and get some rest. We'll discuss this further at your scheduled supply drop. And Marcus?" "Yes. Double-check all your locks. Make sure every window is sealed. If they could appear that clearly, it means something's changing out there." The radio went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of impossible knowledge. He spent the rest of the night sitting in the center of the room as far from all windows as possible, clutching the rule book like a talisman while his mind struggled to process what he'd witnessed. Dead children, a tuberculosis outbreak, manifestations. The rational part of his brain insisted on explanations. Hallucinations brought on by isolation. Maybe carbon monoxide poisoning from the generator, anything but the alternative. But his gut knew better. The children had been real as the terror still coursing through his veins. As dawn broke through the forest canopy, Marcus forced himself to approach the east window again. The ground below looked normal, pine needles and fallen branches scattered naturally, no sign of the perfect circle where 7 ghostly children had sung their haunting melody. But when he looked closer, he could see slight depressions in the earth. 7 small spots where the pine needles had been compressed by small feet. Marcus opened his logbook with trembling hands and began to write Day 19, 11:47 p.m. Rule 12 incident. 7 manifestations observed at Tower Base. Victorian-era clothing. Singing unidentified melody. Duration approximately 4 minutes. No physical contact with tower structure. Reported to base. Incident concluded at 11:51 p.m. with immediate disappearance. Note: ground disturbance visible at manifestation site. Evidence suggests physical presence rather than visual hallucination. Personal observation. The rules aren't protecting us from forest dangers. They're protecting us from something that was already here. He closed the logbook and stared out at the seemingly peaceful forest. Somewhere in those trees, 7 children who died 80 years ago were waiting for dark to fall again. And he was beginning to suspect they weren't the only ones. The supply drop 2 days later brought more than food and equipment. Ranger Walsh arrived with a grim expression and a thick folder marked Classified. Tower 7 Incidents. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, settling across from him at the small table. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting something to appear. "We need to talk." She opened the folder, revealing decades of incident reports, photographs, and what looked like medical examiner documents. "This forest has a problem. Has had one since the 1940s, maybe longer. What you saw the other night, those children, they're just the beginning." Marcus flipped through the reports, his stomach churning. Photos of Forest Service employees found catatonic at their posts, their hair turned white overnight. Recordings of radio transmissions in languages that linguists couldn't identify. Detailed drawings made by previous lookouts showing creatures that shouldn't exist. "Why wasn't I told about this during training?" "Because 90% of people who know the truth quit within a week," Walsh said bluntly. "We've learned it's better to introduce the reality gradually. Let people adjust to the rules first, then explain why they exist." "What happened here? Really?" Walsh pulled out a faded newspaper clipping dated March 15, 1943. The headline read, "Tuberculosis Claims 7 at Remote Logging Camp." Below it was a group photo of the camp's children, 7 young faces that Marcus recognized with a chill. The Miller Logging Company set up a camp here in 1941. Families lived on site, about 40 people total. When TB hit, they quarantined the sick children in a cabin while waiting for medical transport. But a winter storm blocked the roads for 3 weeks. By the time help arrived, they were all dead. Worse than dead. The isolation, the fever, the fear, something went wrong. Their bodies died, but their consciousness got trapped here, anchored to this place by trauma and terror. Marcus studied the photograph. The children looked normal, happy even. It was impossible to reconcile these smiling faces with the black-eyed entities he'd seen. That was just the beginning. Other incidents started almost immediately. Loggers reported tools moving by themselves, voices calling from empty cabins, equipment failures that defied explanation. The company pulled out within 6 months, but the Forest Service took over the land and built fire towers here knowing it was haunted. Walsh's laugh was bitter. We built towers here because it's haunted. This forest is a containment zone, Marcus. Our job isn't just fire prevention, we're monitoring supernatural activity and making sure it doesn't spread beyond these boundaries. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. You're telling me I'm not a fire lookout. I'm a paranormal guard. You're both. The fire risk is real. These entities can manipulate electrical systems, start blazes through pure psychic energy when they're agitated. But yes, your primary function is observation and containment. Walsh pulled out a more recent report dated just 2 months earlier. Marcus's predecessor, Jake Morrison, had filed increasingly erratic entries before disappearing entirely. His final log entry was a single line: "They're getting stronger. The rules aren't enough anymore." What happened to Jake? We found him 3 miles into the forest, sitting in a clearing with his eyes wide open and unblinking. He'd been there for 2 days, completely catatonic. When we finally got him to respond, he kept saying the same thing over and over. "They showed me what I used to be." Where is he now? Psychiatric facility in Seattle. He's not the same person anymore. Sometimes he draws pictures of things he shouldn't know about, detailed layouts of the old logging camp faces of people who died here decades before he was born. The doctors say it's impossible, but the drawings are photographically accurate when compared to historical records. Marcus felt the walls of his small tower pressing in on him. So the children I saw, they're just part of whatever's happening here. The children are the anchor point, the original trauma that created this situation. But they've attracted other things over the years. Lost hikers who died in these woods campers, who ignored warning signs, even some of our own people who stayed too long and got absorbed into whatever this place has become. Walsh reached into her jacket and pulled out a modified radio, larger and more complex than his standard equipment. "This is a direct line to our paranormal research division. Use it if anything happens that the normal rules don't cover." And Marcus, she met his eyes with an intensity that made him shrink back. "Don't try to understand them. Don't try to communicate. Don't try to help. The rules exist because every single person who's broken them has either died or wished they had." That night, alone again in his tower, Marcus found himself studying the rulebook with new understanding. Each protocol represented someone's death, someone's encounter with forces that operated outside natural law. Rule 5: if you observe figures in historical clothing, do not make eye contact and do not attempt communication. Rule 9: sounds of construction or machinery during night hours indicate temporal displacement. File report, but do not investigate. Rule 14: if animals behave in coordinated unnatural patterns, it indicates external control. Maintain distance and log incident. The radio crackled at 10:15 p.m. Marcus grabbed it immediately, grateful for any contact with the outside world. "Tower 7, this is base. We're picking up unusual electromagnetic readings from your sector. Report your status." Marcus scanned the forest through his windows. Everything looked normal, too normal, he was beginning to understand. "Tower 7 operational. No visual anomalies detected." "Copy that. Be advised we're showing significant disturbances in sectors 8 through 12. Multiple energy signatures moving in coordinated patterns." Marcus's blood chilled. Rule 14: base request clarification on nature of disturbances. Negative Tower 7. Maintain position and observe only. Do not investigate under any circumstances. The radio went dead, leaving Marcus in silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He checked his watch. 10:18 p.m., 7 hours until dawn. At 10:45 p.m., he saw the first lights. They appeared between the trees in Sector 9, small blue-white orbs that moved with purpose through the forest. Not the random floating of swamp gas or ball lightning, but deliberate navigation around obstacles. As Marcus watched through his binoculars, more lights joined them until a procession of maybe 20 entities wound between the Douglas firs. They were heading straight for his tower. Marcus grabbed the special radio Walsh had left, but hesitated. The lights weren't threatening, yet just approaching. Maybe this was normal. Maybe this was why Rule 23 existed. If you see lights moving below the tree line in patterns, close all curtains and do not observe until dawn. He reached for the curtains, then stopped. Something was wrong with the lights. As they drew closer, he could see they weren't floating freely. Each orb illuminated a human silhouette walking beneath it. Men in work clothes, women in simple dresses, children in nightgowns, all moving in perfect synchronization toward his tower. The dead of Olympic National Forest were coming home. Marcus slammed the curtains shut and backed away from the windows, his heart hammering against his ribs. But closing the curtains didn't stop the sound that began moments later, dozens of voices singing in harmony, the same haunting melody the children had used 2 nights before. Come and play, come and stay, where the shadows dance and sway. The voices surrounded his tower, now rising from all directions. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all blending into a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his bones. Marcus grabbed the emergency radio with shaking hands. "Base, this is Tower 7. Multiple manifestations surrounding tower, requesting immediate extraction." Static answered him. The normal radio was dead too, its display showing nothing but electronic snow. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus heard something that made his knees buckle: footsteps on the tower's metal stairs. Someone was climbing up to him. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each metallic clang echoing through the tower's frame like a countdown. Marcus pressed his back against the far wall, eyes fixed on the door that suddenly seemed impossibly thin. The lock's 3 heavy deadbolts felt like paper barriers against whatever was climbing toward him. Clang, clang, clang. 27 steps to reach the top. Marcus had counted them every day for months. He found himself counting now, his lips moving silently as terror carved hollows in his chest. 15, 16, 17. The emergency radio crackled to life, but instead of Walsh's voice, he heard something impossible, his own voice speaking words he'd never said. "Base. This is Marcus Chen. I have made contact with the entities. They're not hostile. They just want to show me something. I'm going to investigate." "Negative, Tower 7. Walsh's voice cut through the static, sharp with panic. "Do not investigate, Marcus. Respond immediately." But Marcus hadn't touched the radio. His voice continued broadcasting, "It's beautiful, Base. You can't imagine how beautiful it is down here. I understand now why Jake stayed, why they all stayed." "Marcus!" Walsh screamed through the static. "Break contact immediately. That's not you transmitting. 23, 24, 25. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. Marcus stared at the 3 deadbolts, watching in frozen horror as the top one slowly began to turn. The metal groaned in protest, but the lock disengaged with a soft click. The second lock turned next, then the third. The door swung open. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, but it wasn't Jake anymore. The man Marcus had seen in personnel photos, young, confident, alive, had been hollowed out and refilled with something else. His skin had the waxy pallor of a 3-day corpse, and his eyes were the same black voids Marcus had seen in the children. "Hello, Marcus." Jake's voice was his own, but wrong somehow, like an echo speaking before the original sound. "I've been waiting to meet you." "You're dead." The words tumbled out before Marcus could stop them. Jake tilted his head with inhuman precision, the movement too sharp, too angular. I can still think, still feel. I'm more alive now than I ever was before. They showed me things, Marcus. Incredible things." Behind Jake, other figures filled the doorway. The 7 children from 1943 still in their white Victorian clothes. Men in loggers' gear from the 1940s. Women in simple house dresses. All with those terrible black eyes that reflected nothing. "We're not here to hurt you." Jake continued, stepping into the tower. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight. "We want to show you what we've learned, what we've become." Marcus fumbled for his radio, but Jake moved faster than humanly possible, crossing the room in a single fluid motion to place one ice-cold hand over the device. "The radio won't help you now. We've been listening to your conversations with Base for weeks. Did you know they have a termination protocol for this tower? If you become compromised, They'll send a cleanup team to eliminate both the threat and the witness." "That's not true." Jake's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "Isn't it? How many previous lookouts do you think they've told you about Jake Morrison was number 47? You're number 48. Want to know what happened to the other 46? Images flashed through Marcus's mind, not his memories, but somehow clear as day. Forest Service employees found in clearings with their hair turned white. Others discovered catatonic at their posts. Some who simply vanished, leaving only empty towers and logbooks filled with increasingly desperate final entries. They don't die, Marcus. They join us. They become part of something larger, something eternal. No more loneliness, no more fear, no more wondering if you matter in the vast indifference of the universe. One of the children stepped forward, a little girl with dark curls and a blood-stained collar. When she spoke, her voice was sweet and innocent. "We were so scared when we got sick, mister. But then we learned dying isn't the end. It's just changing into something better." "The tuberculosis didn't kill us," Jake explained, his black eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "It opened us. The fever, the delirium, the desperate fear, it tore holes in reality. We fell through those holes into something wonderful." Marcus backed against the window, feeling the cold glass against his shoulders. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to choose," Jake said simply. "You can stay up here following rules that will never protect you, watching us from a distance until you inevitably break down like all the others. Or you can come with us willingly and become part of our family." The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "We have such fun together. We play games that last for decades. We sing songs that make the trees grow in spirals. We know secrets about the forest that the living could never understand." "And if I refuse?" Jake's expression didn't change, but somehow conveyed infinite sadness. "Then you'll stay here, getting a little crazier each day until eventually you do something that breaks the rules. And then we'll have to come back for you anyway, but you won't be ready for the transformation. It will hurt so much more." Marcus looked around his tower at the logbooks filled with desperate observations, at the radios that could be silenced at will, at the windows that offered no escape, only the illusion of safety. And how many nights had he spent here counting the hours until dawn? How many times had he convinced himself he was serving some greater purpose when really he was just a canary in a supernatural coal mine? "What happens if I come with you?" The little girl clapped her hands together. "You'll see. You'll see everything." Jake extended his hand. "Trust us, Marcus. We've been where you are. We know how this ends either way. At least this way you get to choose." Marcus stared at the offered hand, knowing that touching it would change everything forever. The choice, he realized, had already been made the moment they'd climbed his stairs. Marcus reached toward Jake's outstretched hand, his fingers trembling as they approached the pale, cold skin. Time seemed suspended, the tower caught in a moment between heartbeats where reality balanced on a knife's edge. Then the emergency radio burst to life with Walsh's voice sharp and commanding. "Tower 7, we have authorization for immediate extraction. Air support inbound ETA 3 minutes. Hold your position and do not engage with any manifestations." The sound broke whatever spell held Marcus frozen. He yanked his hand back and dove away from Jake, rolling behind his desk as the tower suddenly erupted in chaos. The entities didn't disappear. They screamed a sound like metal tearing that made the windows rattle and Marcus's teeth ache. "You can't run from us." Jake's voice had lost its gentle tone, becoming something raw and hungry. "There's nowhere in this forest we can't find you." The children began that haunting melody again, but faster now, more urgent, the words blurring together into a chant that seemed to vibrate through the tower's metal frame. The adult figures pressed forward, their forms becoming less solid, more like shadows cast by fires that weren't there. Marcus grabbed the emergency radio. "Base, they're in the tower. Repeat, entities have breached Tower 7. "Copy that, Marcus. Helicopter is 2 minutes out. Whatever you do, do not let them touch you. Physical contact allows permanent attachment. Attachment. They'll be able to find you anywhere after that. Maintain distance until extraction." The entities pressed closer, their forms shifting between solid and smoke. Jake's face contorted with frustrated rage, his features becoming less human with each passing second. "You don't understand what you're giving up. We're offering you immortality." "Immortality is what?" Marcus shouted back, keeping the desk between himself and the advancing figures. As something that preys on the living, as something that drives people insane. The little girl stepped forward, tears streaming down her translucent cheeks. We're not bad people, mister. We're just lonely. We've been alone in the dark for so long. For a moment, Marcus felt his resolve waver. These had been real people, once children who died in terror, families torn apart by disease and isolation. But then he remembered Jake Morrison's hollow eyes, the previous lookouts who'd vanished or gone insane, the careful protocols built on decades of tragedy. I'm sorry, he said and meant it. But this isn't the answer. Jake's form began to dissipate, becoming more shadow than substance. This isn't over, Marcus. We know you now. We know your voice, your smell, your fear. You can leave this tower, leave this forest, but part of you will always belong to us now. The helicopter's rotors became audible, growing louder by the second. The entities flickered like bad reception, their forms becoming unstable as the aircraft approached. The living world won't satisfy you anymore, Jake whispered as he faded. You've seen too much, felt too much. Eventually, you'll come back to us. They always do. The last thing Marcus saw before the entities vanished completely was the little girl's face, still tear-stained and innocent, mouthing words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. We'll wait for you. Then the tower was empty, except for the sound of his own ragged breathing and the approaching helicopter. Marcus was alone again, but somehow that felt worse than being surrounded by the dead. 6 months later, Marcus Chen sat in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, watching normal people live normal lives through rain-streaked windows. He'd been discharged from Forest Service duty after the Tower 7 incident, given a medical pension and a carefully worded non-disclosure agreement that threatened federal prosecution if he ever spoke about his experiences. The official report listed his breakdown as acute stress reaction due to prolonged isolation. Clean, clinical dismissible. 3 other lookouts had been similarly discharged over the past decade, according to the files Walsh had shown him during his debriefing. You're lucky to be alive, she told him as he signed the paperwork. Most people who encounter them directly don't make it out with their sanity intact. But Marcus didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, like something essential had been carved out of him and left in that forest. Food tasted like ash. Colors seemed muted. Sleep brought dreams of black-eyed children and the echo of songs that made his bones ache. He'd tried therapy. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was kind professional understanding. She listened to his carefully edited version of events, stress isolation, auditory hallucinations brought on by prolonged solitude. She prescribed medication-recommended meditation, suggested he find a hobby to rebuild his connection to the normal world. Trauma can manifest in many ways, she'd explained during their last session. Your mind created these experiences to cope with extreme psychological pressure. The important thing is recognizing they weren't real, but they had been real. That was the problem. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through apartment listings for the 3rd time that day. Nothing felt right. Urban life seemed too bright, too noisy, too disconnected from the natural rhythms he'd grown accustomed to during his months in the tower. Even this coffee shop felt claustrophobic, full of people who'd never experienced true silence, true isolation, true understanding of what lurked in the spaces between civilization. He found himself checking Forest Service job postings obsessively. Tower positions in Montana, Alaska, Oregon. All of them called to him with an intensity that worried his therapist. You need to break the cycle, Marcus. Find something that connects you to people, not isolation. But people felt alien now. Their conversations about sports, politics, Netflix series, it all seemed so trivial compared to the vast mysteries he'd glimpsed. They lived in such a small world, unaware of the forces that surrounded them, the thin barriers that kept their reality stable and safe. His laptop chimed with a new email. The sender was listed as pawalsh@forestservice.gov. But when Marcus opened it, there was no text, just an attachment labeled Tower 7 Final Report.pdf. Marcus hesitated. He'd signed papers promising never to seek out information about his former assignment. But his finger was already clicking the file before his rational mind could intervene. The document opened to reveal not an official report, but a single page of handwritten text. Marcus recognized Jake Morrison's writing from the logbooks day 127. They were right about everything. The living world is just shadows now. Colors are gray, food is tasteless, and the silence of normal life is deafening. I can feel them calling to me every night, especially when it rains. They're patient. They know I'll come back. We all come back eventually. If you're reading this, Marcus, it means you've started to feel it too. The emptiness, the disconnection, the knowledge that you've seen behind the curtain and can never unsee it. Tower 7 is always looking for experienced personnel. They say I went crazy, had a breakdown, but we both know the truth. I saw what they offered, and now I understand why it's impossible to refuse forever. They're waiting for you just like they waited for me. And when you're ready, really ready, you'll know where to find them. The forest remembers everything, Marcus. Even you. Marcus closed the laptop with trembling hands and looked out at the Seattle skyline. 48 stories of steel and glass reaching toward a gray sky filled with people who would never understand what he'd experienced, what he'd lost, what was calling him back. He opened the Forest Service website and began typing in his login credentials. Some choices, he realized, were made long before you understood you were choosing. Outside it began to rain, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard children singing.